StarFox 64, also known as Lylat Wars in the PAL regions, was released on the Nintendo 64 in 1997. Taking great inspiration from the first two planned Star Fox games, Star Fox 64 was developed as a reboot to the series and a transition from the Super Nintendo. It took heavy inspiration from the unreleased sequel to its predecessor, Star Fox 2 on the SNES. While Star Fox 2 was near completion, its development was dropped in favor of combining elements from both Super Nintendo games into one more elaborate entry. And thus, Star Fox 64 was born. It was the first game to use the Nintendo 64's Rumble Pack and ended up being the 8th best-selling N64 game of all time. It even sold 500,000 copies within the first 5 days, surpassing the records of both Super Mario 64 and Mario Kart 64. So, what's so great about Star Fox 64? Maintaining the same story of the first game on the Super Nintendo, the once great scientist Andross has been banished to the far planet of Venom, where he appoints himself Emperor and declares war on the peaceful Lylat system, specifically those in Corneria who wronged him. After a failed mission by his father, Fox McCloud forms a new Star Fox team and promises to make the galaxy safe again. He is joined by several friends and allies on his team, who he must take care of and return home safely. Among these friends are short-tempered ace pilot Falco Lombardi, wise veteran flyer Peppy Hare, and the timid yet enthusiastic mechanic Slippy Toad. The animal characters, specifically Fox, were inspired by the, Fushimi Inari Taisha Shrine in Kyoto, Japan. Other Japanese folklore and expressions inspired the inclusion of a bird and hare in your team, and the war between dogs and monkeys. The interlaced storylines of Star Fox 64 hinge more around the characters you meet and the interactions with your team, not just your actions within each level. Sure, flying through specific obstacles or shooting specific targets will open a new direction, but without a specific character there, you have nothing to propel you into the optional path. Helping a character will affect your interactions with them down the line as well. This not only affects your main squad, but the side characters such as Bill. The interactions and dynamics of every character you meet creates a simple story full of charm, triumph, and camaraderie. Your motivations are laid out very plainly in front of you. Help your friends, defeat the big bad boss, and save the galaxy. To fully understand the gameplay style of Star Fox 64, we have to consider the comparable mechanics of the first entry and take a look at the long-lost Star Fox 2 game, previously unreleased to the public before the announcement of the Super NES Classic Edition console. Other than this, the only other option for playing Star Fox 2 is emulating the nearly finished ROM. Beginning in the first game, the majority of gameplay is in 3D scroll mode, also called corridor mode, or a rail system, which is very common for arcade-style games. In the same thread of arcade-style gameplay, all Star Fox games by this point embrace the ideas of no continues, collecting items or stacking kills for extra lives, and embracing a high score system to encourage multiple attempts at the game. Star Fox 2, which loaned several of its mechanics to what would become Star Fox 64, had a very different style of gameplay than the first installment. The majority of the game was in what would later be called all-range mode in Star Fox 64. In fact, there are very few moments in Star Fox 2 that could have been considered linear gameplay. The N64 entry brought more balance to this by reserving all-range mode to boss battles and specific combat-oriented stages. Not only all-range mode, but multiplayer mode and the Starwolf scenarios also all came from Star Fox 2. In fact, the developers of both titles said that about 30% of Star Fox 64 was recycled from its unreleased predecessor. However, any mechanics reused from the previous entries were greatly improved or adapted to better fit the next generation game. One such difference was the removal of traditional difficulty options. That is to say, you can't choose it on a menu before starting the game. Instead, difficulty is determined by your level of success. This goes hand in hand with another change. The adaptation of non-linear paths influenced more creative interactions with enemies and teammates throughout the game, as your abilities open new experiences to you. As with most arcade-style shooters, bosses have specific weak points usually designated by a glowing panel. The trickier bosses have more discrete weaknesses. It could have been extremely easy for Nintendo to make all-range mode battles way more difficult, but luckily they scaled those bosses by making the entirety of their ships vulnerable to compensate for their increased speed and dodging abilities. Constant motion maintains excitement throughout the adventure as, simply enough, you can't stop moving. There is no form of standing around and looking for your next objective. Everything is literally delivered to you. The way they keep this from being boring is by leaving certain cues up to player interpretation, and certain objectives up to player choice. Fox McCloud is the commander of his team, and in his shoes, you better be ready to make quick decisions in the field. It's understandably difficult to make space look interesting. It's really just a black screen with some stars, maybe a bunch of rocks around you. What made StarFox enjoyable to look at was how Nintendo filled your immediate area with interesting obstacles and ornaments. First off, every planet brings a new atmosphere, literally, with dynamically different environments and enemies. A brief view of the planet from space enforces a sense of curiosity to what you may witness down among the next world. The atmosphere of each planet varies wildly in color and opacity, giving a sense of thickness to the air, presenting an obvious environment that could feel hot, muggy, or fresh. Next, your vicinity is filled with debris, buildings, or environmental hazards to bring moving changes to what could have been a bleak or repetitive rail line. Nintendo also took advantage of the draw distance within the empty moments of space, bringing faraway objects into view just in time to register what they are. With enemies, this gives you just enough time to decide how to attack or dodge. With environmental hazards, the appearance of structures in conjunction with occasional teammate cues nudges the player towards effectively navigating the world around them while maintaining their nearly constant speed. The soundtrack is dark and exciting, meshing both the abyss of space with the thrill of dogfights. Conclusions of each stage are triumphant, energizing the player forward on their journey through the Lilat system. The digital sounds of lasers, thrusters, and lock-on are subtly blended into combat, while more important sounds such as your teammates' voices and the supply drop notification stand out to draw your attention to something either more urgent or temporary. Even the characters' voices throughout the game demonstrate their personalities before hardly anything is said. Leaders like Fox and Bill have calm voices. Villains often sound much more gravelly like the Shogun Warlord, or nasally like Pigma and Andrew. This elicits a great instinctual response to encourage the player to deal with each character accordingly, because who doesn't want to make Pigma shut up? Consider the fact that StarFox 64 was the second best-selling game of 1997 after Mario Kart 64. This small following game that previously was little more than a tech demo now came second only to Nintendo's signature mascot. That is quite a feat. So, what's so great about StarFox 64? Nintendo embraced the consistent movement speed and tight hitboxes of NES and Super NES era games and brought those mechanics into a 3D plane. They properly advanced the control of motion for new spaces and battle experiences. Miyamoto has even credited the N64 version as the perfection of StarFox gameplay. It's plain to see why. Everything is put together in a perfect puzzle piece layout of complementary details, where the smooth gameplay and atmospheric design transport you through a great sci-fi story of camaraderie and the fight for what is right. And, as an added bonus, StarFox 64 hosts some of the most memorable quotes in all of gaming.
Do a barrel roll!
That is what's so great about StarFox 64. Thank you all for joining us on this episode of What's So Great About Gaming as we flew through the universe of StarFox. If you have a favorite series or a single game that you think is great, leave a comment of your choice and we'll look into it. If you feel there is something about StarFox 64 that didn't get enough attention, let us know. We'd love to discuss it with you. By the way, if you want to keep up with updates or hints about upcoming episodes, you can find us on Twitter at WSGA Gaming. Thanks again for watching. Now go play a great game. We'll see you next time.